Shocking reports have emerged from Syria in the wake of President Bashar al-Assad's ousting, painting a chilling picture of the country's descent into even greater chaos. According to a recent report by Al Jazeera, there have been disturbing accounts of former regime officials being executed in public, with videos purportedly showing these executions rapidly going viral across social media platforms. The footage, which has sparked outrage and widespread condemnation, appears to depict violent scenes of individuals believed to be former Assad loyalists being executed in open, public spaces. The videos, though graphic and deeply disturbing, are adding fuel to the already intense international debates surrounding the future of Syria. In many of these clips, individuals, some of whom appear to be high-ranking officials from the Assad regime, are seen being led to their deaths by armed groups. The scenes capture the brutal, swift nature of the executions, with little to no form of legal or judicial process involved. These executions have ignited widespread speculation about the identities of the individuals involved, many of whom are reported to have held significant positions within the Syrian military, intelligence, or political apparatus under Assad's rule. Syria's political landscape has been in disarray since the civil war broke out in 2011, and Assad's eventual ousting has only intensified the sense of disorder and violence. For over a decade, the Syrian conflict was characterized by a brutal fight for power between Assad's regime and various opposition groups, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths and the displacement of millions of people. Assad, despite facing substantial opposition both within Syria and from the international community, managed to retain power throughout the conflict, largely thanks to military support from Russia and Iran. However, with Assad's recent removal from power, Syria finds itself in an entirely new phase of instability. The power vacuum left by his ousting has led to a violent scramble for control, with various factions, some seeking to establish an Islamic state, others looking to consolidate secular power, fighting for dominance. The reported executions of former regime officials appear to be part of this larger struggle, with factions attempting to eliminate any remnants of the old order while sending a stark message to their rivals about the harsh consequences of aligning with Assad's regime. The executions are being framed by some analysts as part of a larger pattern of retribution that often accompanies regime changes. In the wake of major political upheavals, particularly when one faction ousts a ruling government, victorious groups sometimes resort to acts of extreme violence to assert control and intimidate potential threats. By executing those aligned with the old regime in public, the new groups are signaling their power, sending a message that any support for Assad's regime will be met with swift and brutal punishment. Human rights groups have condemned these actions, with organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch demanding an independent investigation into the killings. Both groups have expressed concern about the lack of accountability in the wake of such extrajudicial executions, calling for those responsible to be held accountable under international law. These executions, they argue, represent a stark violation of basic human rights and an assault on the principles of justice and rule of law that should govern any society, particularly one undergoing a transition. The situation in Syria has raised alarms about the treatment of individuals associated with the old regime, with fears that these public executions are just one part of a broader pattern of persecution targeting Assad's former supporters. Reports from human rights groups have pointed to an increase in arbitrary arrests, torture, and other forms of violence against individuals suspected of being affiliated with the ousted regime. These actions seem to reflect a broader campaign of political cleansing, as new powers attempt to eradicate any remnants of Assad's influence from the country. The international community's response to the situation in Syria has been mixed. Western countries, particularly those that have been critical of Assad's regime during the conflict, have largely condemned these acts of violence. The United States and the European Union have called for the protection of human rights in Syria and have urged the new authorities to take a more measured approach to governance. In particular, they have emphasized the need for a peaceful, inclusive transition that respects the rights of all Syrian citizens, including those who were formerly loyal to Assad. However, other powers in the region, particularly Russia and Iran, have largely remained silent regarding the executions, continuing their support for the Syrian government, even in its post-Assad incarnation. Both Russia and Iran have strategic interests in Syria, particularly in terms of military and geopolitical influence, and their silence on the issue underscores the complexity of the situation. Russia, which had been a key ally of Assad's regime, has shown little inclination to interfere in the internal politics of the post-Assad state, despite ongoing human rights violations in the country. This lack of a unified international response has led to questions about the effectiveness of global institutions in addressing crises like the one currently unfolding in Syria. The United Nations, for example, has largely failed to take decisive action in response to the continued violence and human rights abuses in the country. While the UN has expressed concern about the situation, particularly regarding the executions and other violations of international law, its ability to bring about meaningful change in Syria remains in doubt. The fate of Syria, and particularly its ability to navigate this new phase of conflict without descending into further bloodshed, remains uncertain. The viral spread of these videos depicting executions and the ongoing reports of widespread violence are clear indicators that the situation is worsening. Syria faces a real risk of further fragmentation, with the country now divided among multiple armed factions, each vying for control and willing to resort to extreme violence to achieve their goals. As the situation in Syria continues to evolve, it remains unclear what the future holds for its citizens and the country as a whole. The rise of new, often radical groups in the wake of Assad's fall, combined with the growing tendency for violence and retribution, suggests that Syria may be entering an even more dangerous phase of conflict. The brutal execution of former regime officials may be just the beginning, with many analysts warning that the power struggles could lead to even more widespread violence across the country. The international community must act swiftly to prevent further escalation of the crisis in Syria. The ongoing human rights abuses, including the execution of former regime officials without trial, highlight the urgency of addressing the situation before it spirals further out of control. While the road to peace in Syria remains fraught with challenges, it is clear that the country's future hinges on the ability of the international community to provide meaningful support for a peaceful transition and to ensure that justice is served for the victims of violence. Without such intervention, Syria could remain mired in conflict, with no resolution in sight.